Thank you for that gracious introduction. It's a great pleasure to be your Founders' Day lecturer. I'm going to speak tonight about a figure who some historians of science believe is one of the most neglected figures of the whole 18th century. Now, there are reasons for this neglect, and the life of this figure has finally been compiled. It took me a long time to do it. I think there's a copy upstairs, as your president has said. The difficulty with talking about this figure is that the story is not entirely happy. And people prefer happy stories to unhappy stories. This is not entirely an unhappy story. It has plenty of happiness in it. But it also has its dark, you might say, Scandinavian shadows. And it's some of those shadows I'm going to try to tease out briefly this evening. The usual paradigm for 18th century nature is that the 18th century, in this country as well as in France, Germany, most of Europe, developed a new taste for nature. That is, a taste that had not been present in the 17th century, for example. And the reason this taste developed is very clearly owing to socio-economic developments in Western Europe, specifically the rise of what we would call middle classes. That is, the rise of leisure time that enabled a new appreciation for nature. And with this appreciation came a taste of the sense that nature was something more than science, that nature had its spiritual dimensions, and that those spiritual dimensions could not be removed from nature. Now, nature and natural history are, of course, not the same thing. Nature is a larger, more encompassing umbrella than natural history. But natural history can be defined as that aspect of the natural world which has been here from all time, from time immemorial, that basically involves animal, mineral, vegetable. That kingdom of animal, vegetable, mineral. And in the 18th century, natural history, and this is the most important thing, natural history was not a respected science. Physics, astronomy was respected. Even more so was medicine, which had been venerable throughout centuries and ages. There were very few posts in the 18th century in natural history. You could count them on the fingers of two hands. Therefore, no father would tell his son to go out and make a living in natural history. You could become a botanic keeper at only 2 universities. You could go to the Chelsea Physic Garden, but if you add up these posts, they would total certainly no more than 20. So the people who were engaging in this natural history were gentlemen. That's very important. And indeed, if you read the lecture, the founding lecture in 1788 of this society, when Smith gave his opening address, he said that natural history would be furthered by gentlemen, I quote now, of rank and fortune. And that's very important. They were not people who didn't have fortune, who were not titled or didn't have enough means in order to pursue this education. So the natural history is not filtering downward from the professionals. It's not coming from the university and the cognoscentia and the intelligentsia, coming down. It's coming upward from amateurs. And if there's any province of endeavor in the 18th century that is an amateur province. It is natural history. Of course, banks will transform it, and the world in the Royal Society at the very end of the century will further transform it. But in this liminal period, from about 1700 to this society was founded in 1788. So if we get the chronology right, from about 1700 to 1775, this is an amateur vocation. Now, the usual story in the textbooks, and even in university and college lectures, is that this new taste for nature, developing in the middle class and filtering through cults of sociability and sensibility, and all the way up into romanticism amongst philosophers and literati, is a very happy story. That is all very true. But in the period, in the second half of the 18th century, when natural history becomes spread throughout the land, it is riven with politics. So the moral, you might say, is that even amateurs can engage in politics, and in pretty dirty politics. And the way I would present it is through a microhistory, the biography of this still very unknown, obscure creature called John Hill. If you go to the Bodleian Library and look him up, you will find over 130 books. If you go to the Great Welcome Library down the road on Euston Road and look him up, you will find just about 100 titles, which is pretty good on a percentage basis. If you go to the British Library, not much further down the road, you will find over 200 books by this 18th century figure. This is not someone who's writing in the age of digital technology. This is someone who's writing in the middle of the 18th century. Now, how did I come to this creature? If I may have an excursus that is somewhat biographical. It was my own PhD viva. And in the American Ivy League universities, the way the viva works, which is somewhat different from Oxbridge, the way the viva works is that you are permitted to be examined in any aspect of your subject. My subject was the 18th century. So they could ask me anything about 1701 to 1799. If they asked me about 1699, I could reply, I don't have to know that. But they could ask you anything within those 100 years, such as one examiner asked me, name all the cats you can of the poets of the period. And they took that up and followed it with dogs. So I had to ransack my head for the dogs of Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, and etc., etc. The final question in this viva was by the chair of the committee, who was a rather naughty Texan scholar. He was a great scholar, Swift scholar. And he said, you've done rather well, Mr. Rousseau, but I want to ask you, what can you tell me about Sir John Hill? I went blank. I had never heard of this figure. And he said, are you sure you can say nothing about this man? I said, no. Terrible. I wasn't nervous. It was about 58 minutes into the hour at that point. Well, he said then, step out of the room. The way they work is they take you out of the room. By the amount of time you're out of the room, you can figure out if you have passed or failed. If it's 3 minutes and they come out and call you back in, you've passed. If it's 15 minutes, you know they're debating something that's going to sink you. Well, I think it was about 8 or 9 minutes. I was sure. I'd done rather well, but I didn't know who Hill was. So I was sure this sank me, and he was going to come in and say, we're very sorry. But anyway, they called me back in and said, you have passed. However, the committee feels that you should apprise yourself, and you can see how the rest of it goes. So I went straight from the exam room to the university library and looked him up in the old DNB. You know, we didn't have the new one at that time. Column after column after column, and over 100 books. So when I got my first job a year later, I began collecting on little 3x5 cards. We didn't have digital technology at that time. Everything I could about this figure, and it became a sort of pastime of fun. It wasn't my real research, but I was doing it on the side as if I was a kind of collector, a natural history collector. And that's the art. And I published the first volume of his Letters and Papers about 15 years later, and what's finally come out is the interpretative biography. Now, Hill, as a boy, he was the second son of a very stoic minister in Northamptonshire, Anglican Church of England, who wed together physics and natural history. This was very common at the time. Men of the church were very often creatures who had studied physics or medicine in university, but because of their religious propensities, became curates, ministers, churchmen, as did Hill's father. A very small parish in Northamptonshire, poor family, and the father believes in Stoicism. Theophilus Hill actually believed that suffering was good for you, that if you had to live on £20 a year, which in buying power today would be something about £20,000 a year, that's good. You know, it's below the poverty line, but it's good to suffer. But he did take his two boys, the older boy and John Hill, to botanize. And you can see how engravings of this sort idealize botanizing. It's as though you're out in nature amidst the beautiful flowers and bushes and trees, unlike the city. And by the time that Hill is growing up, of course, this Hogarthian city is a filthy, fetid, polluted place. So the idealism, the utopian rusticity of the botanizing of Hill as a boy. Except that the young John has some kind of personality disorder. Now, some of my colleagues are trying to persuade me that he had Asperger's. And there's something in it, terribly bright, cutting wit, hypomanic. He cannot stop. He doesn't sleep 3 hours a night. As I've just told you, over 150 titles of books, etc., etc. What is the problem? Well, the thing that held me up from publishing the big interpretive biography was the psychological pulse of the man. He was polymathic, that I knew, and I could have organized it as Hill the polymath. I could have been a Sigmund Freud and analyzed it along the lines of the deep, dark psychoanalytical Hill. Married, has 10 children, only 6 of whom survive. But it didn't seem right. And I must say, the more I ponder this Asperger's possibility, the more I tend to like it. Not that I'm going to do anything with it, because the biography is published and there isn't a word in there about Asperger's. But the syndrome seems to fit the character more and more. Hill was bought an apprentice to an apothecary by his father. He couldn't go to university because there was only enough money to send one son to Cambridge, the older son. Second son knew in that period that they would very often be denied university. And this grated on the young Hill because he was 10 times more clever than his older brother. So his father scrapes enough money together to buy him an apothecary's apprenticeship in London, where he inhabits this kind of world. Public spaces, this is the celebrated Dr. Rock. I think this engraving, if I'm right, is in the great collection of medical images in the Wellcome Institute, but I couldn't swear to that. But notice the Caravari kind of world that Hill inhabited, with all the street players and the jocular, robust, frisky kind of activity. This is not a world of universities or schools. Hill didn't go to schools. His father taught him at home Greek and Latin and to read. And then he goes into this world of central London in the late 17th 30s. There is also a similar engraving of Hill dressed as an empiric in the British Library. Wonderful thing that Hill is dressed up as if he's some kind of German apothecary. And this is the only book we know of the young John Hill, which is in the Barber's Hall in this city, perhaps printed by a well-known portrait painter. We're not sure about that. He works as an apothecary until Lord Peter at Ingatestone in Essex, one of the great collectors of trees of the 18th century, one of the greatest collector of trees in this country. This is the Lord Peter who is the cousin of the Arabella Fermor Peter in Pope's poem, The Rape of the Lock. You may remember in that wonderful comic epic poem, there is a Lord Peter who snips the little lock of Arabella Fermor, and that Lord Peter is the cousin of the botanical Lord Peter, whose estate is in Essex. So by the age of 17, Hill goes to work for Lord Peter, and there in his great botanical library, Hill first hears about Linnaeus, which is very important because the date is not later than 1739, possibly 1740. Lord Peter died in 1742, so it's got to be in the very end of the 1730s. And that's the question the naturalists have asked again and again. Where did Hill first hear about Linnaeus? Now, Goodwood, well, you know in this country what Goodwood is now. Horses and racing and pleasure grounds and etc. If you're over down in that part of, is it near Chichester, I think it is. If you're down there going to the peak. But in the mid-18th century, it was a tremendous intellectual salon. The Duke of Richmond had all the French intellectuals visit him. He had a theatre which brought down the best actors and actresses from London. It was quite a center in Goodwood. And there Hill first develops the notion that he wants to be a kind of star, a celebrity, like these visiting dignitaries. But he has a falling out. Here's possibly the Asperges coming up. He has a falling out with the Duke of Richmond around 1739. He leaves in a huff and puff. He moves up to London, to this place, to the Adam and Eve Tavern, which is not very far from this very Burlington house. It's on the other side of Piccadilly towards Golden Square. At that time, taverns and coffee houses were distinguished. A coffee house had more elegant people, it tended to have coterie society, whereas taverns brought in almost anyone who was interested. And Hill lived in the rooms upstairs, and in these rooms lived a Jewish naturalist, Emmanuel Mendes da Costa, who became the treasurer of the Royal Society before he embezzled them out of thousands and went to prison. So at this place, in the Adam and Eve Tavern, as early as 1743, is living perhaps the most gifted naturalist of the mid-century, and the man who's going to be at the pulse of the heart of the Royal Society, and he becomes the most important fossilist of the age. Da Costa and Hill worked together in those early years, collecting fossils, shells, marbles, botanical specimens, anything for the great Whig lords, Peter, Richmond, Northumberland. Why do they do this? Because you need a patron at that time to live. And if you can't find patronage, you'll starve. This is the great lesson for people like Hill and Da Costa. Of course, Da Costa gets picked up by the Royal Society, so he doesn't have to worry anymore. Of course, he was elected FRS before he became their treasurer or secretary. And he was the first Jew elected to be an FRS in this country. Hill was not so lucky. he could not get elected. In fact, he couldn't get 2 sponsors to vote for him. This is a very dark and sad story. Why? Because he's antisocial, because he offends people, because he can't read through the codes, because he is, well, I dare not say somewhat autistic, but he cannot see how the social codes of society work. However, he goes to Henry Baker's Wednesday afternoon club in Red Lion Square. All this occurs, in about 2 miles from this very building. He goes to Henry Baker's Wednesday club, which was a gathering of FRS in more informal settings than they had before. And there they would discuss all the big problems of the day. Henry Baker was in America, when I give talks of this sort, I like to say he was the Pearl Mesta of natural science in the 1740s. He loved to bring people together, as this prince says. Henry Baker, fellow of the Royal and Antiquarian Society, the Society for the Encouragement of Manufacturers, and all his other distinctions. Very sociable, just the opposite of Hill. He gave Hill every benefit of the doubt until Hogarth came to one of the Wednesdays. Hogarth was a regular, and Hogarth said, this fellow Hill is really insufferable. We've got to get rid of him. And Baker said, well, I couldn't get him elected to the Royal Society, but he's so gifted. He's a prodigy. He's so brilliant. What are we going to do with him? Well, you see what Hogarth did just 2 years later. He put all Hill's books in the lower right-hand corner. And that's what Hogarth thought in Beer Street of Hill's works. So I come back to the task of any biography. I don't know if you've written biographies, but if you are an academic scholar and you undertake to write a serious biography, the one thing you must get right, if it's a first biography, is the pulse of the figure. Because everyone will follow that from that time on, and they'll just crib and say the same thing. If it's a revisionist biography, you're writing the 84th biography of Shakespeare, or the 95th biography of, you don't have to worry because you can trust. But if you're writing the first one, you want to get it right. And in his case, I wasn't sure, and that's why I left out the Asperges. So what does Hill do? He can't get elected to the Royal Society, and when Da Costa tells him we couldn't even get 2 sponsors to vote for you, Hill turns on them, his wicked pen, and writes 3 satires against the Fellows of the Royal Society. The one on the right, a review of the works of the Royal Society containing animadversions on such papers as deserve particular observation, in 8 parts, by John Hill, M.D. Notice he signs himself Academy Royal Boudensis. This is the Royal Academy of Bordeaux. When he was down at Goodwood, he met some of the scientists who came up to Richmond's place, and they elected him in absentia, fellow of their society. But the epigraph is delicious. It's from Pope's Dunciad, and it reads, I can't read it too well here, maybe now that one's even worse. It reads like this is against the FRS, of course, like a rolling stone, thy giddy dullness. This is the Fellows. Thy dullness will propel you on as blockheads. It's the third of the satires that became a bestseller. Lucina Scinicum, to Lucina, this young maiden, conceives without the commerce of a man. It's very Swiftian, it's very satire. It's very much like a modest proposal, where we should sell all our children because it will solve the hunger problem in Ireland. If you fatten them up, then they'll sell for more on the open market. It's a satire of that sort. And in this satire, Lucina is walking out on the hills, and pollen from plants somehow gets inside her body and impregnates her, and she has a baby. And so the proposal is, if all our women could conceive without the commerce of men, society will be so much better. And Hill goes into this wonderful phantasmagoria on what it would be like to have a society without reproduction. Think of all the benefits of no reproduction, of no commerce between the sexes. Now, the French, by the way, just as a footnote, the French picked this up in the 1770s when the Ancien regime is crumbling and the revolution is beginning to murmur. And they don't know anything about this work, but they think it's an allegory prognosticating the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. So Lucina is France, and she's going to give birth to this new thing, the revolution. So that's a sort of another life that Hill has. Well, you can imagine what it was like being a fellow of the Royal Society and waking up in 1750 to find yourself named in these prose satires by Hill. He became overnight persona non grata, so that if the Asperges was there, if the Asperges was real, if he is as antisocial as he seems to be, 6 months later, he was virtually non grata. In another 6 months, he writes his first botanical work, A General Natural History of Animals, Vegetables, Minerals, and this volume, 1751, is the volume on the plants. And it is this volume in which Hill calls attention to Linnaeus, the first work in English that attempts to insinuate Linnaeus into the realms of natural history without using Linnaean nomenclature or classification. And Hill hung on to this and said, I am the first to have introduced him to my country. But this was to become very, very much contested. I just want to say something very briefly about the Republic of Letters in the middle of the 18th century. It's not a real country. It's an imaginary republic to which you belong if you are a gentleman of science. And if you belong, you're obligated to do three things. One, to be generous to other gentlemen of science. They weren't gentlewomen of science yet. They are doing science, but they're not codified in the same way. Two, you're obligated to correspond. So if a gentleman of science writes to you from another country, you can't bin the letter. And three, you should go on the grand tour to see what's out there. Hill didn't do any of those. He couldn't go on the grand tour because of financial reasons, but he is not in any shape or form inside the Republic of Letters. If you want to see what the Republic of Letters was about, the second Earl of Macclesfield, who's president of the Royal Society at this period in the mid-1750s, actually writes an edict on what the response, just as the president wrote and said what it is to be in the Linnean Society. Macclesfield says, if you want to be in the Republic of Letters, these are your obligations. And in the left hand, in Crane Court, this is what they are doing at the Royal Society in this period. They are enacting gentlemen of science activities. In the right, you have a voting, an occasion where the white cards are counted at just the sort of period in which Hill would not have been elected FRS. Now, there's one other transformation occurring socially in this period, and that is the new developing Georgian celebrity culture. I'm not going to say much about that because we don't have time, but this is one of the new things among academic historians right now, at this very moment, about what's developing in Georgian culture, early Georgian culture. Well, having become persona non grata, having no source of income, having to make it for himself as a wit, Hill, of course, goes to Grub Street, Fleet Street, and becomes an author. And he can write very quickly. He can outwrite almost anyone on the scene. He writes faster and as glibly and hypnotically. Tobias Smollett, the novelist, journalists of the period, novelists like Fielding, poets like Christopher Smart. He angles with all of them, he attacks all of them, he enters into fracases with all of them. It's a very venomous world in the second half of the 18th century amongst the literati. For example, he has a feud with Fielding just to show him up. This is Fielding of Tom Jones. I mean, Hill always went for the jugular. He doesn't believe in attacking the small fry. He wants to go for the very top. And so he gets himself into a fight. He loves to pick fights with Henry Fielding. Fielding was magistrate by day, writes by night, but he's sitting on the court banging his mallet, and he's defending at this time a young girl who claimed she was kidnapped by an elderly gypsy woman. It'd be like today, read every day in the newspapers, young teenager kidnapped by elderly woman, etc. Hill took the other side of courts to oppose Fielding, and he prevailed in court. It turned out that the adolescent was lying because she was pregnant. So you see, Hill prevailed in this one. That gives him the opportunity to write 3 or 4 treatises contra Henry Fielding. And where does he live? Not very far from here at all. He takes a wonderful apartment in St. James's Square, just behind the Ritz, where he can see tout le monde, the greats, promenading, wear his fine clothing and white gloves, medical cane, married a minor Irish aristocrat who came with some money. That's how he was able to afford this place. By 1752, a very interesting caricature appears, which is in the British Museum, showing the greats of the age. And you'll see, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to call your attention to Dr. Hill in the lower left-hand corner with that young girl I just referred to, escorting her to prison, since she was found to be culpable. So the point is, lusus natura, or caricatures of the present age. These are the celebrities of the present age. They are wonders of nature because they are so well known, each in his own field. And what is Hill so well known for? Well, it's going to be botany. Because poor John Hill, Asperges or not, started to develop gout in his late 40s, and he could no longer prance about and attack as he was doing. So he realizes he's got to do something else by 1760, and that is botanical. He can collect, he can grow, he can write about botanical subjects. It doesn't take the same energy. He had educated himself, after all, in the libraries of those great Whig lords who were botanists themselves at Goodwood and later on in London. But it's his meeting of Lord Bute that transforms his life. He wrote letters to all the great Whig lords of the day. That's what I published in the first volume. All these letters looking for patronage, these supplications for patronage. And Lord Bute, often known as the Maecenas of botany, said, who is this fellow Hill? I mean, I've heard so much about him. Well, Hill was a household name by 1755. Who is he? Bute picks him up and becomes his patron, which was probably the best thing that ever happened to John Hill. Bute says, what do you want? And Hill says, I want to write a vegetable system of all the plants in the whole world. Typical of Hill. It will be 26 volumes when it's finished. It will measure this high. It will sit in state royally. It will total thousands upon thousands of pages. It will incorporate the Linnean system. It will be published by subscription. Numerous booksellers will carry it. Who's going to fund this? Bute will fund it. Except that Bute became Prime Minister, as you know, and Bute fell from power. And as soon as that happened, Bute cut off his ties with Hill and no longer funded it. But Hill was 1763, only 3 volumes have appeared of the 26. Hill's going to continue funding the other 23. And this is what's broken. He's getting older, weaker, goutier by the day, and poorer by the day. He colors most of the plates himself. Here's just one example of the asters in the top. The very top, you see the Astor cordifolius. In the lower left, you see the Astor italicus. And in the lower right, the Astor dumosus. We're not certain that Hill colored all of the 25 volumes. The 26 never appeared, but he certainly engraved and colored most of them. He sends copies throughout Europe. One of the disappointments of the biography is that I could not get his bank accounts at Coutts. You know, 18th century bank accounts are in this city. If you're writing a biography of an 18th century figure, you want to go to Coutts and get the bank accounts. But if the biographer's subject is named John Hill, Coutts had 300 John Hills in the 18th century. They only allow you 5 a year. Well, I would have to go into the 23rd century to have exhausted all the John Hills. If only he had some totally unusual exotic name. So I had to speculate about all financial matters. I think we got most of it right, because he never went to debtor's prison, and his wife had some money, otherwise he couldn't have lived in St. James's Square. Nevertheless, when Linnaeus received volumes 1 and 2, he wrote, "I fainted at the sight of Hill's great work, with the most beautiful plates of plants on each alternate page, but I could weep. I could weep when I saw such a costly work without botanical science." And what Linnaeus means, of course, is nomenclature and classification. Hill is very erratic in both his nomenclature and his classification. Indeed, he's so erratic that a half-century later, taxonomers are still trying to figure out in 1799 or 1800 exactly how his classification system worked. Yet he continued to assert he was the first to introduce the Linnean system to England. I think it was Patrick Brown in 1756 who introduced it, that is in a systematic way. But in 1751, as I suggested, Hill certainly introduced Linnaeus, and in 56, in the British Herbal, he applied some of Linnaeus. The problem is that Hill doesn't apply Linnaeus systematically. Now, my friend Brent Elliott down the road at the Royal Horticultural Society has written that Stafflew's old conclusion about Hill in that wonderful book, Linnaeus and the Linnaeans, is inadequate and unfair to Hill. And I think Brent Elliott is right that Stafflew's perspective was far too narrow Linnaean, and that there is much to be said in favor of Hill. Stafflew had written, "The vegetable system is of great importance because it gave for the first time in the vernacular a comprehensive treatment of the plant kingdom on a lavish scale and with colored illustrations adopting the Linnean generic names and introducing binary nomenclature." This is right, but I think Eliot is far more accurate when he says, Hill's text, he means the vegetable system, of course, remains a fascinating period piece from the taxonomical and nomenclatural points of view. It contained important speculations about hybridization and geographical distribution, and in its attempted coverage of the plant kingdom. It provides a useful source of information about the plants that could be seen in botanic gardens, at least in the second quarter of the 18th century. And I think for this reason, Hill is probably the single most overlooked botanist in the whole of the second half of the 18th century. This is just a scheme trying to argue where Hill's place would be in that introduction and acceptance of Linnaean ideas. But as late as 1798, that's 40 years later, one of the important French taxonomers, Mouton-Fontenay, in his Tableau des systèmes de botanique, is claiming that Hill is an important taxonomer who should be better known. And he writes, Il de la Société de Londres a publié plusieurs grands ouvrages sur la botanique. On peut assurer que c'est la plus grande entreprise connue en botanique. That his vegetable system is the best well-known work in botany of the second half of the 18th century. But what became of Hill? He moves to the juncture, you can see his plot of land, on the Bayswater Road in Leinster Gardens. It became Tea Gardens by 1800. There's a blue plaque there now. Some of you may know it, but it's not for Hill, I'm afraid. It's for a successor. This is the Vendramini portrait of Hill, engraved by Roger Coates, after Hill was decorated by the King of Sweden. Linnaeus may have wept at some of his taxonomy and nomenclature when he saw the vegetable system. Nevertheless, he persuaded the King of Sweden to decorate John Hill and give him a knighthood. When Hill was knighted, he applied to George III, who, after all, had been the tutor of his patron. That connection is Bute, George III, Hill. And of course, George III said yes, he may use his title, so he became John Hill. So where are we in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen? Well, certainly a wonder of nature, a caricature of the age, a deeply important botanist, but a rather dark story because it doesn't fit any of the paradigms that we have about nature in the second half of the century. Thank you very much.